Got it. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the History Center of Olmsted County. My name is Madeline Lawler, and I'm the education coordinator here. And tonight, we are excited to be hosting Andrew Wood as he gives a talk on his new book, Life at High G-Force. But before I hand the show over to him, my boss would be disappointed if I didn't plug our membership program. We are membership driven, and I like to say this could be free if you are a member. So without further ado, here is Andrew Wood.
All right, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I guess I'm going to start this off with a question. You know, since this is in the Rochester community and in Olmsted County, how many out there knew Earl Wood? A few of you. Okay. So this is about Earl, my father, and Mayo Clinic just released this through the Mayo Clinic Press, Life at High G-Force. So I want to give you a little bit of review of who Earl Wood was. He was born in Mankato, Minnesota in 1912, one of 6 children. And my grandparents must have done something right because each of those kids was highly accomplished academically. And they were at the height of each of their chosen professions, whether it was business, law, medicine, research, or biochemistry. For instance, the tall guy there, Chester Wood, was Dean of Students at UMD up in Duluth. The little girl there was the head of Girl Scouts of America, the executive director, and was the former head of the Red Cross in Europe during World War II. The little kid that is looking down is Harlan Wood. He was a biochemist at Case Western Reserve University. And if anybody knows anything about biochemistry in here, if you know what CO2 fixation is, he worked with a guy by the name of Dr. Krebs. If you know the Krebs citric cycle, that was Harlan Wood. And the person that's on my grandfather's lap is Earl at the age of 2. This is where Earl grew up, on a 20-acre farm on the banks of the Blue Earth River near Mankato. At that time, there was no indoor plumbing. There was no electricity. And this is where the team concept came into being for that family, because they had to milk the cows, they had to clean stalls, they had to plow the fields, they had to mow the hay just to survive. And each kid had their own job. So they lived there up until Earl was about the age of 12. In 1921, my grandparents purchased an old hotel on the banks of Lake Washington, on the east shore of Lake Washington, I should say. This was a hotel that was built in 1898. When they got it, they formed it into a beach business. And this is before the days of municipal pools like Soldiers Field, like we have here in Rochester. And people from Mankato, St. Peter, and the surrounding area used to come to Lake Washington, to Woods Hilltop Beach, to escape the heat of the summer. And here again, you see Earl and his brothers working as a team to make this business thrive. And you can see down there on that left-hand corner. And then the 4th of July, of course, was their big business day. People came from miles around, and they had a marathon that would swim across Lake Washington from the west side to the east side. And Earl was the first one to finish it back in, I think, 1931. He did it in about an hour and 10 minutes. I did it when I was in college in about 20 minutes. This is what the place looks like today. Okay, it still stands. So if you get to the eastern shore of Lake Washington near Mankato, That is the old Woods Hilltop Beach. Earl graduated from high school in 1930 and got an athletic scholarship to Macalester College. He graduated in 1934, and at Macalester is where he met his lovely bride, was the brother of the captain of the basketball team, Denny Peterson. And in 1934, he enrolled in medical school at the University of Minnesota. During his second year, he was approached by a Dr. Morris Vischer, convinced him to enroll in the new MD PhD program at the University of Minnesota. So he dropped out of medical school his second year and pursued a master's and a PhD in physiology. He finished that PhD, and that's the name of his dissertation, in about 1940, which his dissertation was the distribution of electrolytes in water between cardiac muscle and blood serum in reference to the effects of digitalis. And digitalis in those days was the therapeutic drug for cardiovascular disease or cardiac disease. He then didn't enroll, but he took a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And at that time, that's when things were heating up in the Pacific and also in Europe. And so to avoid getting drafted into the infantry, he went back to Minnesota to finish his MD degree, which he finished at the end of 1941. If you look at that picture on the left side, there he is in his whites. The back of that picture states Big Lake, Minnesota. That's where my mother is from. December 7th, 1941. So at that point, he was offered a position at Harvard University. And he was in the pharmacology department studying under a Dr. Otto Cryer. And Otto Cryer is noted for discovering that acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. So he was a big time in the physiological side of things. And he was also German, but he escaped Nazi Germany because he was asked to take a position at the University of Dusseldorf because the former person that was in physiology was Jewish, and he refused to take that position. And so he went off to the University of Beirut, and then from there, University College London, then ended up at Harvard. Okay, and Earl was actually quite satisfied working at Harvard. He liked Boston. So he thought that was going to be his career. But let's talk about what happened after December 7th and what happened in aviation from the time of the Wright brothers to World War I. Okay, we saw an advance in aircraft. They went from fabric-covered aircraft, very flimsy, to fighter planes during World War I. These are still covered with fabric, but their ceiling, they could only go up to about 8,000 to 10,000 feet because their engines weren't supercharged and the pilots couldn't take the elevation. Fast forward into World War II. The aircraft were now supercharged, all right? They could go up to 30,000 feet. They were also all steel, metal, all right? And they were very maneuverable, high speed, maneuverable. And then they could go higher. Now, keep in mind, these were not pressurized aircraft, all right? And B-17, for instance, they wanted to get that thing up to 40 to 45,000 feet so that they could escape the flak and even fighter aircraft. So what happened is that the aircraft advanced, but the human body did not. And here are the challenges of flight. Altitude. When you go up in altitude, the air pressure drops, the partial pressure of oxygen drops, all right? You have trouble breathing, you get decompression sickness, there's cold, there's noise, and you also have acceleration. Now, this picture is of a P-51. Okay, the P-51 Mustang, when that came out in 1943, it totally outperformed the human body. So that was the challenge. So the war was actually more of a physiological war than a war on the infantry. So the airplanes at that time, as this cartoon says, I'm built for speed, changes in temperature and pressure, and there's the pilot. I'm not built for any of these things. So there's their challenge. So let's take a look at air pressure. Okay, when you're at sea level, all right, the air pressure is 14.7 pounds per square inch. Okay, it's actually very heavy. What you have to imagine is 1 square inch, okay, at sea level, but that is a column 100 miles high. Okay, so it's actually very heavy, all right? And the partial pressure of oxygen is 3. Now you go up to 10,000 feet, all right, the air pressure drops down to about 10 pounds per square inch. Partial pressure is about 2. Okay, at this point, you get what we call oxygen want. All right, so that would be your body compensates, your heart rate increases, the depth of your respiration increases, the frequency increases to overcome that. You go up to 12,000 feet, okay, what will happen is that you'll get performance issues. In fact, you get kind of high. It says, hey, I feel pretty good, but the performance starts to go down. At 18,000 feet, you might pass out. At 26,000 feet, you are going to pass out. There's no question. Okay, so you have to think about Boyle's law. Got any chemists in the area? Okay, Boyle's law is gases expand and contract depending on the pressure put upon it. Anybody ever tried cooking at altitude? You ever go camping up in Colorado and you boil water or have a cup of coffee? And the problem is it's colder. Okay, it doesn't get as hot because steam dissipates much quicker. Okay, so there was some research going on at Wright-Patterson Field, actually in the early 30s, by Henry Armstrong. And he actually discovered what they call the Armstrong limit. And he put experimental animals or even different body chemicals into a hyperbaric chamber and found out at about 62,000 feet, all of our body chemicals, whether it's saliva, blood, urine, whatever, will boil. So at 65,000 feet or 62,000 feet, life is not sustainable. Okay, but we know we've got aircraft that fly that high. How did we ever get anybody up to the moon? Okay. Then the other thing is decompression sickness. Just like when someone's deep sea diving and they ascend going from 100 feet to the surface, they end up getting the bends. Okay, if you shot off in a rocket from sea level up to 60,000 feet or even 20,000 feet, you're going to get decompression sickness. Okay, so you have to have a suit that is pressurized. Now, the first pressurized suit that came out was actually done by Wiley Post. He worked with B.F. Goodrich, and he had a pressurized suit, and he also had supplemental oxygen in there. And it worked. And Wiley Post flew a Lockheed Vega, the same aircraft that Amelia Earhart flew in from California, and he was going to try to fly all the way to New York. Okay, but he got up to 40,000 feet. And they found out, gee, when I'm at this altitude, my ground speed's a lot higher. So it's economically feasible and better to fly at altitude versus down here at lower altitudes. The thing is, he only made it as far as Cleveland because he ran out of oxygen, so he had to land. So that was the first pressurized suit. Unfortunately, Wiley Post died in a very tragic aircraft accident with one famous comedian. Do you know who that was? Will Rogers. Yeah, up in Alaska. Now, here at Mayo, they're working on problems of oxygen want and pulmonary problems. And they actually had a hyperbaric chamber, and Doctors Boosby, Lovelace, and Bullion actually developed a mask, all right, that people could wear in an airplane so they could overcome oxygen want. And there was a hyperbaric chamber, and they developed, again, they call the BLB mask, or Boosby, Bavilion, and Lovelace. And you can see them, they're in a hyperbaric chamber. They're both here at Mayo and also at Wright-Patterson Field. And the derivative of this mask was worn by every U.S. Air pilot in World War II that were at altitude. And they did test this out on a passenger plane, and they flew a DC-3 from Minneapolis to Burbank with passengers using the BLB mask, and none of them suffered from oxygen want. Now, the other issue that we have are G-forces. Okay, right now, all of us are subject to 1G, okay, one gravitational force. Now, with these highly maneuverable aircraft, okay, if you're making a turn, okay, or coming out of a dive, all right, you're subjected to more G-forces, okay? And what happens is that the blood will actually go from heart level, actually will pool in the legs, or the heart does not have enough strength to bring the blood up to head level, okay? So here's what can happen. As you can see on this graph on your left side, okay, at 1G, okay, what will happen is that you've got enough blood pressure to get to head level. Okay, at 2G, you still have enough. At 3G, what tends to happen is that you'll lose peripheral vision. Okay, the optic nerve, okay, and the eye is very sensitive to blood loss and oxygen. Okay, if the blood pressure gets down to a certain level, okay, you're going to get what we call a graying out. Okay, you lose peripheral vision and then you lose central vision, but you're not necessarily unconscious. You can still be conscious, but you're still graying out. And then beyond that, okay, you lose consciousness. Now, here is a typical example of what we call gravitational loss of consciousness. Now, this subject is actually in an aircraft. The G meter you will see on your left side. Okay, so right now he's at 1G. Let's see what happens. And you'll see that G meter. And, you know, he's looking around. Oh, I don't feel good. Zonk. Now, watch what happens when he comes to. He has no idea where he is. He doesn't have a clue. And he may even have some spasms going on. So imagine being at the control of an aircraft and you come out of a turn, you lose consciousness, and then waking up and having no idea where you're at. So that's gravitational loss of consciousness. Now, the second suit that came out was done by Wilbur Franks. He was Canadian. And his idea was, well, if you're pulling G, all the blood pools out of the abdomen into the legs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a suit that's filled with water. Okay. And he had a suit that they actually tried in the RAF in North Africa in 1942. Now imagine being a pilot in the heat of the Sierra Desert, very little ventilation, covered with water, and not a lot of maneuverability. Not only that, it's heavy. So it didn't work that well. At the same time, guess who else is working on these things? The Germans. All right, the Germans were very aware of gravitational loss of consciousness. They were very aware of oxygen delivery at altitude. They were also very aware of being exposed to cold. And there's a couple names on here I want you to pay particular attention to. Heavius Schuckel. He was the head of aviation medicine in Berlin. He reported right to Hermann Goering. Okay, he is the father of German aviation medicine. So just remember that name a little later on. Randy Lovelace took a trip to Germany in 1939. This is before hostilities started. And he actually met Schuckel. And he toured several laboratories dedicated specifically to aviation medicine. and he found out there were about 40 other laboratories throughout Germany working specifically on the various things that pilots were having trouble with. And he had to leave Germany early. Remember, this is 1939. And what happened in 1939? Germany invaded Poland. He said, I got to get out of here. But he said, we are in a world of hurt. And the good thing is, now Randy in my mind is a real hero because he had connections in the right place. He knew Franklin Roosevelt's personal physician. And he went to Washington and said, hey, Doc, we've got to get on the ball here because the Germans are way ahead of us. And the other thing is he went and talked to the Mayo Board of Governors, and they okayed for us here at Mayo to do aviation research and contracted with the US government for $1 a year. I would say that was a pretty good investment. Okay, that's the medical science building. The medical science building was brand new at that time. So it was divided up into two parts. Okay, oxygen delivery and anoxia. Okay, there was Walter Boosby, Randy loves this, Art Baboyan, and then they added Fred Helmholtz. In acceleration was E.J. Baldus and Charlie Code. And Charlie Code worked with Earl while he was doing his PhD up at the University of Minnesota. In September of 1942, we got a visit from Charles Lindbergh. And Charles Lindbergh was working in the hyperbaric chamber with the development of the bailout bottle. Okay, that was a separate oxygen bottle with which the pilots or air crew would take with them if they had to bail out of their aircraft. If they had to bail out of their aircraft and they're at 30,000 feet, okay, they had to have supplemental oxygen for the descent. So he was working on, changing from the regular mask to the bailout bottle. He took his mask out there at 35,000 feet and he passed out. Okay, in the chamber with him, okay, there's that gal on the left side there, okay, that's smiling. That's Lucy Cronin. Lucy Cronin looked over at Lindbergh, saw that he passed out, put the oxygen mask back on and did an emergency descent in the hyperbaric chamber and saved his life. Now to test the bailout bottle, Randy Lovelace commandeered a B-17, took it up to 41,000 feet, took the bailout bottle and jumped out. And the bailout bottle worked. Unfortunately, when he hit the ripcord on his parachute, the shock of the parachute blew his glove off, frostbit his hand, and that ended his surgical career. Meanwhile, working on acceleration, E.J. Baldus and Adrian Porter were working on the development of a human centrifuge. And this is their working model of the human centrifuge. This was set up in the Franklin heating station. And the concept was they had a flywheel on the bottom, which would be clutched to a gantry, and then it would spin it around. And they actually used this for some human experimentation. You notice where Dr. Baldus is standing, there's an aircraft seat there. They actually spun people around in a sideline position. And here is the initial design of the human centrifuge. And I'm going to move around just a little bit just to show you that it was powered by an old Chrysler engine, okay, attached to a transmission and differential. And then there was a tire here that powered or connected onto a flywheel. There were two 20-ton flywheels. Okay, imagine spinning those things around, and then that would clutch to a superstructure. And this was 37 feet in diameter, and the room was 40 feet in diameter. Okay, so you're going to see this working here in a couple minutes. Now, the flywheels, okay, they got from a water pumping station in Cincinnati, and they were initially designed to be vertical. Okay, so what the engineers at Mayo did is they mounted them horizontal, so you can imagine the pressure on those bearings as they were spinning. Now, anybody ever been influenced by a movie? Well, this movie influenced two people of two totally different backgrounds in two different parts of the country. The movie Dive Bomber came out in 1941, starring Errol Flynn and Fred McMurray. Okay, baby boomers, remember Fred McMurray? You know, My Three Sons? Okay, all right. Well, this depicted the problem that pilots were having in these highly maneuverable aircraft. And what they came up with was sort of a pneumatic belt that they would fit around the abdomen, and pilots could go up at altitude and the belt would inflate and it would prevent them from passing out. So that's one interesting thing about it. The other thing is that the movie depicted the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. Okay, so just remember that because we're going to revisit that in a minute. But this is who it influenced. A guy by the name of David Clark. Now, David Clark was not a scientist. In fact, he didn't even have a degree. But he owned a factory that made undergarments, you know, things like brassieres, girdles, and so forth. And he had a product called the straightaway, which is very much like cycling shorts that you see today. And he said, you know what? I can make a better garment. And what he did is he put football bladders in the thighs and then also down in the calves and would inflate them. And he thought, I think this is going to prevent, you know, the pilots from passing out. And so he went to several aircraft manufacturers and Air Force bases, and he finally connected with a Major Otis Benson. And he said, hey, you need to go to Mayo Clinic. They've got a human centrifuge. You could try it out there. So he wrote Mayo Clinic, and Charlie Code got the letter and said, yeah, this would be kind of interesting. So Charlie and E.J. Baldus decided to go out and visit him in Worcester, Massachusetts, where his factory was. But that wasn't the real reason they went out to Massachusetts. The main reason they went out to Massachusetts was to offer a job and interview this guy, okay, Earl Wood. Well, you know what? He turned him down. He says, I like working here at Harvard. It's pretty cool stuff. Fast forward a couple of weeks, he went out on a date with my mother, and what movie did they see? Dive Bomber. And it changed his mind. The next day, he went in, resigned from Harvard, and he was here in Rochester in July of 1942. In November of 42, my lovely sister was born. So, Acceleration Laboratory at that time consisted of E.J. Baldus, Charlie Code, Earl Wood, Ed Lambert, came from the University of Chicago, MD, PhD. Of course, Dave Clark, Adrian Porter, who put this thing together, Roy Engstrom, who was a technician, and good old Lucy Cronin. And then they brought on Ralph Stern, who was a consultant working with the Bendix Corporation. Ralph is kind of an interesting dude. He designed the landing gears, the first landing gear that was electrically powered. He also designed the landing lights on the Ford Tri-Motor. You know, so he knew it was electricity. And then we had Bill Sarge. This is where the centrifuge was housed. So here's the medical science building. And there you can see that circular area, okay, where it was housed during World War II. So this is what it looked like. There are the flywheels. Underneath and right above it is the gantry of the centrifuge. Now, it's interesting. Okay, here we have the various G levels that they had to be at, you know, 1 through 11. This is the RPM of the flywheels. They had to get the flywheels to override the carriage up above. So when they clutched the flywheels onto the carriage, okay, it slowed it down. Okay, so they had to have that calibrated just right. So this is what the cockpit looked like. All right, so they're sitting in there like that. Now, the interesting thing about this picture is that they've got strain gauge manometers in the radial arteries, one at head level and one at heart level. All right, so they're looking at the arterial pressure at both of these levels subjected to G. They're also testing out this little thing, okay, which is an infrared sensor that would sense pulse at head level. Now, this had to be really uncomfortable spinning around at G, with your wrists out like that, you know, with a radial puncture. But they did it. Now, in front of the subject was this. These are some blinking lights. These are peripheral lights. They would blink on, and then the subject would have a little switch on the joystick to turn the light off. All right. If they didn't turn that light off, they knew they were losing peripheral vision. And they also had a central light. Okay, the central light would stay on longer. Okay, but if they lost that, then they know they're pretty close to losing consciousness or being blacked out. Okay, now camera would look at the subject, and what you would see here, there's the ear pulse. You know, you got the acceleration here. These are the lights. Okay, when they're they also looked at noise. So when they gave a buzzer, they had to turn off the buzzer, and you also see the respiration there. Now, that little earpiece, what that did is it measured the opacity of the blood at ear level. That was really important because if they lost that, okay, they knew that this person was either going to black out or pass out pretty soon. So here you see at 2G, there's the opacity right there. And it's still, you know, they're conscious. All right. 3G, they're starting to lose their peripheral vision. 4G, they're blacked out. 5G, they're unconscious. All the data was done analog. There were no computers. There was nothing digital about this. Right? So they had to do everything by hand. So this is a video. I hope I can get this working right. There we go. You're right about that mouse. It is sensitive. There we go. So 2 20-ton flywheels. This is actual footage from back then. And there you see the tire, the differential here. Incidentally, when they started this thing up, they had to go very slowly because that wheel would squeal on the flywheel. Now, these were secret experiments, and they didn't want the public to know that this was actually occurring. So there's the engine, there's the transmission, 6-cylinder Chrysler engine. This is all in the medical science building. And the superstructure in a 40-foot diameter room. And this shows the clutching mechanism. Okay, this is looking at it from below. This is the superstructure right here. That's the flywheel. It's just rotating very slowly. Again, there's the flywheel, see it rotating. And then these are the hydraulic clutches. This is looking at it from above. And I think they made this film more for, you know, showing the military. This is the flywheel. Right there is the flywheel, and this is the outside. And you'll get a close-up here. You can see the clutch come down onto the flywheel. And then the other side is the braking mechanism. Even a color film, that's amazing. So we're going to fire this baby up. Push the starter. Oh, hey, wait a minute. Hit the ignition. There we go. Fire that baby up. Okay, now they're easing the clutch out. Everybody remember what a clutch is? Millennials don't know what that is. There it is. She's spinning. Okay, now this is the clutching mechanism. That's Roy Ekstrom. Okay, and he's looking at the RPM of the flywheels. And then the experiment is going to be, well, what G are we going to get him to? And then what he's going to do is he's going to pull back on that wheel. That'll release the brakes. And then pop the clutch on the flywheel. And that gantry will reach its prescribed G level in 1 turn and a quarter. So you can imagine the acceleration that thing had. So there they are, they pop the clutch. And you're getting quite a ride. Now, on the center shaft, the scientist on the center is controlling the lights and the sound switches. So he's controlling the peripheral lights and the central lights that the subject has to turn off. So you see he's got a joystick. Now the gantry swung out, so it's spinning like this. You can see him turning the lights off. And that hand down here, he's turning the sound off. Well, that was a piece of cake. Okay, let's see. And just here's another example of G-lock. He's going to go up to 5G, turn off the lights. I'm not feeling good. Boom. All right. Now watch when he comes to. He hasn't got a clue where he is. Hello. Now imagine flying an airplane at 300 miles an hour and you come out of that. Okay, to test out if water would do any good to prevent G-lock, they put them into this big tub they call the Iron Maiden. Now, they did find it did protect up to about 4 to 5 G, but beyond that, it wasn't that good and it wasn't practical. You know, imagine having a tub of water in an aircraft. You know, you'd rather have 5 more gallons of gasoline than water. So this is the G suit that they developed. This is what they call the arterial occlusion suit. That's Ralph Sturm. And it was also controlled by a valve. So when they hit G, that valve would come on and it would inflate the suit. Now, initially, the suit would inflate calves, thighs, and then abdomen. Okay, so it had sort of a milking action. They found out that they really didn't need that milking action, so that all came on all at once. So here you see Earl at about 4.5 G, right? And what you see here is that he doesn't have any peripheral lights on. He's basically blacked out. All right, with the suit on, okay, here he is at 7 G. Okay, he's turning the lights out. He's totally conscious at 7 G with the G suit on. So the other thing that was interesting about this laboratory, it was the first laboratory, aviation laboratory, that did simultaneous recordings of various parameters. All right. So here you see this is the G level. Here you see blood pressure. Here you see the ear pulse, and here down here, all simultaneously on one sheet. Okay, so they look at various parameters all in real time. So here's the control. This is at 4.6 G. There's the acceleration. And you can see the arterial blood pressure goes down. With blacked out, there's no ear pulse. Okay. The suit is now inflated, 5.5 G. See the arterial pulses there. They're dim, but you know they're still conscious. Okay, so the G suit there was working at 5 G. Now the other thing they discovered is that some pilots, before they had G suits, when they'd get into a high-speed maneuver, would yell, kind of like when you're on a roller coaster. What happens when you're on a roller coaster? People yell, "Yeah, it was a good time," and they were able to get through that G turn. Well, Earl said, you know, maybe what we need to do is to have a self-protective maneuver to increase our own blood pressure, because what happens during G, the heart does not have enough strength to get blood up to head level. Okay, so if you do a series of real hard Valsalva maneuvers, that'll increase the amount of blood pressure and you'll be able to overcome G. So there's a video of what they call the M1 maneuver. M meaning Mayo. I hope this works. Come on. This is the M1 maneuver. You know, they can call it the grunt. Now, the interesting thing about the M1 maneuver is that every fighter pilot in the world uses this today. And take a look at his eyes. Okay, his blood pressure goes sky high. You know, you can get it up to 200 millimeters of mercury if you know how to do it right. It's contracting the abdomen, the thighs. Now, that being said, anybody ever see the Blue Angels perform? The Navy Blue Angels? Okay, Blue Angels don't use G suits. Okay, they do entirely the M1 maneuver. And the reason is that they're flying in such proximity that they got little hash marks on their canopy where the wing of the next aircraft is. All right. And if they did a maneuver and the G suit inflated, it would raise them off the seat and it would change their perspective of where that wing should be. Let's see, we've seen that one. Let's see if we can go to the next. Okay, so doing a little skywriting here. Okay, here's our problem. By the way, this is over the skies of Rochester. All right, so we're going up to about 10,000 feet and pulling out, hopefully before you hit the ground, and you will see part of the Rochester Airport swing by here. Okay, I'm going to fast forward this a little bit if I can. We've seen that part. I can get my mouse over maybe. There we go. Well, I'm going to try this again because it's pretty significant. There we go. Okay, what you're going to see is using the G suit plus the M1 maneuver. And this is at 7G. You can see he's got the G suit on. But the next round that he's going to do an M1 maneuver plus inflating the G suit. Okay, so here we go. Look at his eyes pop up. Now watch the G meter on your left. 9G, 9 times the force of gravity. He's still conscious. Glad that one was over. So imagine doing 9G. Now, this is at the airport, okay? And they commandeered an aircraft to actually do this in real flight. By the way, what kind of aircraft do you think it was?
T6, wasn't
The same one that was in the movie, the Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. So now they're putting the instrumentation on the subject, poor guy. This is Dr. Ed Lambert, and they instrumented the aircraft just like they instrumented the centrifuge. They are looking at the same parameters, you know, dimming of lights, They had the earpiece on. Here you can see where the ear pulse went to 0. And that's Captain Ken Bailey. He wore a full AOS G suit and trained in it. He's just blowing it up for demonstration purposes. And he's going to get on board. Name of the aircraft was the G Whiz. Now they're connecting that to the air compressor. There's the Dave Clark valve. You see how it inflates. So when they hit G, that valve will open. And there's the Plummer building in the background. So the thing about that 9G run, okay, what happened? This is Earl here, where he was not wearing the G suit, where it didn't contact the skin, he actually developed skin hemorrhages. These are petechia skin hemorrhages. All right. So this is actually overprotection. All right. At this point, this is actually very, very dangerous. So what you saw this summer or last summer in Top Gun when they're doing 10 and 11G turns is a bunch of hooey. Okay, because it's quite dangerous, you know, unless they have a full suit on. But this could subject someone to an embolus or clot, whatever. Okay, so there's the G Whiz. There's Earl in the back of it. Charlie Code, another picture. This is where the airport was. Anybody remember Loeb Field? I remember Loeb Field, aging ourselves here. So for those who don't know, okay, there's the Plummer building, there's Soldiers Field, there's the fairgrounds. This is about where Mayo High School is right now. That was Loeb Field. This is where all the action took place. And you can see, there you see Roy Angstrom. They have the same instrumentation in the cockpit of the G Whiz as they did in the centrifuge. And what they did is they would put this dive bomber. Ken Bailey knew how to fly this thing really well because he knew how to fly it on a particular G run. You know, so if they're doing a 7G run, he would do a circle that was about 800 feet in diameter. That's not a lot. Okay, so they're putting a lot of pressure on it. So here's the data that they got from the dive bombs they were doing, and they do it in sort of a circular pattern or straight up and down. You know, and what he would do, he'd take it up to 10,000 feet and then try to pull it out before they hit 10,000, or excuse me, 1,000. So let's see, another video here. Okay, get it going. Okay, so there's Ken loading it up. Sort of a little repeat here. But this happened all here. And there's our lucky subject. He may or may not be wearing a G suit. Captain Ken, strapping him in. And I love the way they start this thing. Get out of the way. There, you see the Plummer building in the background? There's the G Whiz taking off on a run. So this next one, if I can get it going. Okay, this is Earl in the G Whiz with no G suit. He's going to do the M1 maneuver. He's at 6G. Boom. Hello. Now he's going to do the M1. Keep in mind, no G suit. 6G. He's grunting, moaning. And he knows he's going to do it. You'll see him wink. success. Okay, the final G suit they came out with was called the Cutaway. All right, it was the only thing that was accepted by the Navy and the Air Force. You know, it was much better than a water-filled one, but it gave them mobility. They could also wear it on the outside of their coveralls. This is the same design suit that is worn by every fighter pilot today. You know, it's the same design. That being said, it is not as effective as the original OAS that they developed, but it's acceptable. You know, it's quality versus acceptance, and this is accepted. Now, they added up the number of minutes that each one of their subjects had 0 pulse at head level. So these are the subjects, 1 through 4. I don't know who they are. I can only guess. All right. Number of instances of going unconscious. Okay. The duration of being of 0 pulse at head level. Cumulated time. Okay. Of no pulse on subject number 4, 15 minutes at head level. Do you think it did any damage? I know who this guy was, and he was pretty smart. Okay, let's talk about what happened after the war. Anybody ever hear of Operation Paperclip? Kind of right. Operation Paperclip was sort of a semi-secret program that the United States had to recruit and bring German scientists to the United States side. All right. And a lot of these people took off in hiding. And so the United States had a real interest in getting these guys over to the United States because they could have gone to the Soviet side. Okay. Anybody know the most famous scientists that Operation Paperclip recruited? Werner von Braun. If it weren't for Werner von Braun, there would be no Saturn rocket. There's no Saturn rocket, we would have never got to the moon. As part of Operation Paperclip. So, was Mayo Clinic involved with it? Yes, we were. Okay, there's Earl in Heidelberg, 1946, shortly after the war. They had the aeromedical unit that they commandeered the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Heidelberg, Germany. Okay, which was a scientific institute, but the Air Force took it over. Army Air Force took it over for aviation medicine. Okay. So what they wanted to do was to recruit German aviation scientists to come up with a compendium of German aviation science during and before World War II, so that we could take advantage of it. So this is the visit. Okay, there's the Reichstag, you know, in 1946, burnt out in Berlin. That's what's left of the German Air Force. Now this is the city of Munster. Okay, a lot of the scientists did their academic work in Munster. Okay, the reason I mention that is Munster is also a sister city of Rochester. Okay, Mayor Kim Norton has gone to Munster several times to take a look at the bicycle trails and so forth. It's also a place where I spent my freshman year at college in Munster. Okay, so this is what it looked like in 46. This is what it looked like a couple of years ago when Krista and I visited there. This is the German centrifuge. Was not finished yet. This is in Berlin. But that's E.J. Baldus at the German centrifuge. Luckily, it wasn't finished. And this is Earl. And this happens to be the uniform that he was wearing. And who is he with? Habeas Struckold. Struckold, the father of German aviation medicine. Struckold came over to the U.S., became a U.S. citizen in 1955, worked at Brooks Air Force Base, and actually designed the spacesuit for the Apollo space crew. Now, Operation Paperclip is very controversial. I'll be the first one to tell you that. My personal feeling is that these people should have been tried and convicted at Nuremberg. But on the other hand, what would have happened if these guys would have gone over to the Russian side? We can only guess. So I'll let you guys decide. Okay, so after World War II, the Medical Science Building had some additions made to it. There's the centrifuge. They sort of made a silo to it, and they added on because what they were doing is that they were putting in a cardiac catheterization laboratory. Now, when Howard Burchell was over in Europe in 45, he was actually the start of Operation Paperclip, and he really didn't like it. But he saw the first cardiac catheterization done in London, and he thought, you know, this is where Mayo needs to go. And so when he got back, he asked Earl, would you like to do this? And he jumped on it. And so they developed the first cardiac catheterization lab here at Mayo, which was done in the Medical Science Building at the time, because all the instrumentation from the centrifuge and their experiments and the simultaneous recording of various parameters was done at the Medical Science Building. So here you see here at Lampkin, they're doing both a right and left heart catheterization. The other thing that they were developing at the time was the oximeter. This is a cuvette oximeter here, which looks at the opacity of the blood. And what you see here is blood samples taken as a patient, or I should say a subject, is breathing different concentrations of oxygen. You know, it's 8%, 10%, 12%, 16% room air. If you look closely, you can see that the blood is of a different color. Okay. So it's from here where they actually developed oximetry. Now, they also, remember that little thing they had up on the ear, okay, to measure pulse? Well, what they found out is as they were doing cardiac caths, they would flush a catheter to prevent an embolus at the end. And as that saline went through the blood, it changed the opacity in the ear. Oh, okay, we've got a cuvette oximeter. We also have an ear oximeter. And there is the original ear oximeter made by Waters Conley here in Rochester. And that's my brother testing out the ear oximeter. You can pass that around. So I think this is one of the greatest things that came out of that lab. I mean, anytime you go into an ER, OR, whatever, what do? They put that on your finger. It's not on the ear, but it's on the finger. It's the same technology, the pulse oximeter. Okay, the other thing that they discovered is they could put a dye through a catheter and diagnose a heart issue. All right, so if they put a dye into the left ventricle and they sampled it downstream, okay, it would create a curve like this. It's what they call a dye curve. Initially, they used a product called Evans Blue, but the problem is it turned people blue. Okay, Dr. I.J. Fox came up with indocyanine green, or Fox cardio green, and was much better. So here you can see they can diagnose the atrial septal defect, the ventricular septal defect, just by looking at these curves. And that was all developed here. So this also added to the development of the first heart-lung machine. And that was done in conjunction with Dr. John Curlin, who performed the first open heart surgery here at Mayo and using the heart-lung machine. Okay, fast forward into the 50s. What happened in 1957? Sputnik, and the space race was on. And so they fired up the centrifuge again, but not working on fighter pilots, but working on astronauts. And here we see Don Hegland. I believe we've got some relatives of good old Don in the audience here. There he is in the position of an NASA astronaut. And what they were doing is that they were measuring the forces of G's on entry and re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. So, and at the same time, okay, they still had international doctors coming in. Unfortunately, you can't see this picture here, but you can see Don Hegland up here, Julius Zernan, Willis Van Norman, Bob Hansen, Peter Ruzicka, working on looking at imaging the heart using fluoroscopy and X-ray. And again, still working down here on the centrifuge there again, Ralph Sturm, Lucy Cronin. Now, fast forward into the 1980s, late 70s. And what was happening is that they were getting into computerization of looking at the heart. And the interesting thing about this picture here is that the researchers now were PhDs in biophysics, engineering, computer science, mathematics. There are only two MDs in that picture, Earl and Dr. Eric Rittman, but they're all looking at how can we computerize and look at the internal organs of the chest cavity on a video screen without having to cut open a patient. Okay, so a good example of why we needed these electrical engineers is what we call video densitometry. And this was actually done in biplane. The first time they ever did it on two planes at once, where they had an X-ray come in on an anterior posterior view and another one coming in at a lateral view. Now, this was very tricky at the time because they couldn't have those X-rays cameras fire at the same time because it would scatter the picture. The other thing is that they had to be focused on the same anatomical structure, otherwise it would be inaccurate. Okay, so what they did is they did this in a biplane form. Okay, the first time they did it was with the help of Ralph Sturm and Peter Ozika, and they would record this on broadcast videotape. And then they would transfer that onto a stop action video disc. Okay, remember instant replay? That was on a video disc. All right, new at the time. And so what they could do is they could play it back, and then they would look at the borders between the ventricle and the myocardium, and they would be able to measure cardiac volume, cardiac output, ejection fraction, and so forth. But they said, you know what? This is inherently inaccurate because it only takes in two views. So we got to expand it. So we have to kind of take a look at the television monitors at the time. Okay, this is before digital TV, right? TVs at the time and monitors were basically a stack of horizontal lines, one on top of another, all right? And these lines would flash by you at 60 hertz or 60 times a second, all right? Each one of these lines has their unique waveform. So each one of these lines between Kirk and Spock here creates a waveform. Okay, you take that and put it into a digital form. Okay, then mathematically you could reconstruct that organ from the X-ray fluoroscopy picture. So this is where they came up with the single source dynamic spatial reconstructor, better known as the SSDSR. So this is a single X-ray, okay, with an imaging chain, and they had an object that they would rotate around. All right, and so then they would mathematically reconstruct one of those lines, and they would come up with a cross section. So the picture you see here on the right side is the first cross section of a cadaver heart. Okay, so it's sort of the precursor of the MRI and the CT scan. All right, so biodynamics research unit said, wow, if we had multiple views, we could really get this resolution down. So this is where they came up with what they called the DSR, Dynamic Spatial Reconstructor. And this consisted of 28 X-ray tubes and imaging chains that would rotate around a patient, each firing at a separate time. They wanted to reduce X-ray scatter, right? This was then fed into a high-speed computer and then reconstruct that anatomical structure on a computer screen. So this was way out there in the late 1970s. And they put in multiple grant requests, and they finally got funding from NIH for $5.2 million to build the DSR. There was a problem, though. This was a huge structure. This thing was 20 feet in diameter. Where to put it? The funding was for building the DSR, but there was no funding for a brick and mortar building to put it in. Where are we going to put this thing? And there was a battle that went on, and unfortunately, Earl lost. So in 1979, they took a torch to the axle of the centrifuge and pulled it out of the medical science building. Probably one of the saddest days of my dad's life. But a year later, they moved in the gantry of the DSR, which really ushered in Mayo into the digital age. And this thing was so huge, they had about an inch to spare on each side to get that thing into the medical science building. And this is what it would reconstruct. Okay, so this is a heart, and they could actually slice it mathematically in half and pull it apart. It's what Earl called non-invasive vivisection. Interesting term. So Earl retired in 1982. But what was unique is that he had people working for him for over 40 years, and which is totally unheard of these days. And some of these people weren't even degreed. And you know, this is what I call Earl's heroes. You know, I have to point out Don Hagelin. You know, my dad just loved Don Hagelin. Lucy Cronin. You know, I mean, saved Lindbergh's life, but stayed with Earl for eons. Gene Frank, Don Erdman, Bill Sutter, Jan Donovan. We have Ralph Sturm, Stormy Sturm, and then Julia Zernin. And I have to mention I.J. Fox. I.J. Fox, Dr. I.J. Fox was the developer of Indocyan and Green. Okay, so if you know what that is, you got to thank I.J. Fox for it. 2002, the Ozipka company in Germany, which makes cardiac catheters, cardiac electrodes, cardiac stimulators, expanded their factory. The street leading up to the factory is actually owned by Peter Ozipka, who actually developed that split screen thing that I showed you. He's the CEO, named the street that goes up to that factory in Germany, Earl H. Woodstrasse. Now, it's actually very appropriate because the intersection of Earl H. Woodstrasse is Madame Curie Strasse, so he's in good company. So Mayo contributions, you know, we've got, you know, the BLB mask, we've got the M1 maneuver, we've got the variations of the G suit. All of this is talked about in detail in the book that was just released by Mayo Clinic's press. I hope you enjoy reading it. You know, the nice thing here is there are only pictures in there. You guys got to see the real videos. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or if you've got a book to sign, I'm here for you to talk about it. Yes, sir. Grab some water.
The NASA experiments that started in the 50s.
Yeah.
And they put me in a glass coffin and heated me up and cooled me down for about an hour. I never did find out what that was. You know, but they gave me $5, you know.
Everybody candy gas there.
Maybe you guys have some beer money there.
Yeah, well, they were doing a lot of work on cold exposure. Yeah, and boy, I'll tell you where they're doing a lot of work on that now is University of Minnesota Duluth. They're doing a lot of that. You know, they dump people in Lake Superior and see if they can handle it in the winter.
What kind of an
What's that?
what kind of an airplane were they using for their flights in over the old airport?
Oh, that was a Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, an A-21.
Oh, okay. That Navy?
Yes, that was a Navy aircraft. You know, so they used the Douglas Dauntless in the Battle of Midway. They lost a lot of them.
Awesome.
Yeah.
The guy who sat in the middle of the gantry
Did he suffer any effects from spinning so much?
Well, I can actually give you some personal experience on that because I rode on it once. I was just a little kid. Yes, you would get motion sickness. And you know, there are all kinds of stories. When they first started doing the NASA experiments, they could not control the flushing of the catheters remotely. And so they would have the subject laying down like you saw Don Hagelin in the gantry, and then they had another person riding on top, okay, that would flush the catheters. And apparently the person riding on top really suffered because they had their hands out like this, and their hands would fill up with blood as they subjected to G, and they couldn't handle it very long. I do know some people got pretty sick on it.
Did Germany ever develop?
They were constructing one, but they had a smaller one, but not as large as this. Okay, and then they had a bigger one, you know, which was under construction, you know, but it was destroyed with the bombing of Berlin. You know, their laboratory was the Tempelhof Airport in Berlin.
Andrew will be available afterwards for more questions, and there are books available in the lobby for purchase. But thank you for taking the time.
If I purchase my book, you'll sign it.
Huh? Oh, hell yes. For you?
Want to put your
Oh, yeah.
up here, sir. And maybe I could even find that lovely wife of yours to take my picture with.
Oh, sure.